This Royal Commission was a damning indictment of the culture within the union movement. As the Royal Commissioner himself, Dyson Hayden, said, there was a culture which was antithetical to the rule of law. You've seen details of blackmail and bribery, shortchanging workers, secret commissions. This is quite significant revelations. We've got 79 recommendations which the government will consider, and you've got 93 referrals for potential breaches of law to the appropriate authorities. So Malcolm Turnbull, Michaela Cash, George Brandis will be absolutely seized to this issue in this election year. But
do you think, given this report, Australians will be much more inclined to back you on workplace reform?
I think Australians understand that there is a cost to this lawlessness. And that is falling productivity on our building sites and higher costs. And hospitals and schools and roads either don't go ahead or are more expensive for taxpayers or for consumers as a result of this lawlessness. I'll give you, for example, the Australian Building and Construction Commission came into existence after the Coal Royal Commission. Before the Australian Building and Construction Commission came into existence, 224 days were lost to industrial disputation for every 1,000 employees. 2 years later, after the ABCC came into existence, that number fell from 224 just to 24. That was a $6 billion annual productivity dividend for the Australian economy. And that's why Malcolm Turnbull and Michaela Cash are absolutely focused on bringing back the ABCC and putting that legislation again before the Senate.
Do you have the stomach to fight another election on workplace reform?
I think Malcolm Turnbull's words were pretty unequivocal on this, which is we are prepared to take these issues to the Australian people at an election if we don't get our legislation through the Senate, because the Australian people understand there can't be one law for them and another law for the unions.
What is it in particular you want to see as an outcome as a result of this Royal Commission?
Well, as I said, there are 79 recommendations which the government will consider.
In broader terms?
But in broad terms, we want to see boosted productivity on our construction sites and a greater adherence to the rule of law and greater transparency and accountability. And that's why we have a registered organisations bill. That's why we have the ABCC wanting to bring that back because we think that's the architecture you need to hold these rogue union leaders to account.
Jamie Briggs and Mal Brough, both of them going between the Christmas-New Year period. Explain for us the timing of those announcements.
Well, look, these are matters that have been dealt with by the Prime Minister. When it comes to Jamie Briggs, the Prime Minister's made very clear that he was a capable minister and that he has a valuable contribution to make to the coalition going forward.
And then when the Labor Party was saying that about Peter Slipper and what a great speaker he was, you were all pouncing on the fact that that wasn't the point.
I don't think there's any analogy there, Emma. I know Jamie well. He's a good friend, he's a colleague, he's a decent person, and he's been a very capable minister, and I'm sure he'll come back stronger in the future, having learnt the benefits of this pretty tough experience. As for Mal Brough, he hasn't resigned. He stood aside pending the police investigations and will just let them run their course. But again, he's been a very effective minister both during the Howard government and in his brief time now in the Turnbull government.
What about the claims that really this was about covering up unpopular announcements about Medicare and Gonski?
Oh, look, I think it's got nothing to do with Medicare and Gonski. I think these are issues that the Prime Minister unfortunately had to deal with. He dealt with them very strongly, adequately. He brought a number of his fellow cabinet ministers into the process, and those issues have now been dealt with, and we get on with governing in this, as you say, election year.
So, just quickly before we get on to other matters, on Gonski, the Australian public would have the right to feel a little let down by your government, given that during the election campaign in 2013, the then education spokesman Christopher Pyne and the then opposition leader Tony Abbott had promised a unity ticket on Gonski.
Well, firstly, Simon Birmingham's made clear nothing's changed. This is a beat up by the Labor Party, and we've actually supported greater funding for education consistently. And as the Prime Minister's also made clear, key issues here are quality of teachers, autonomy for schools, and obviously building towards a national curriculum. These are some of the issues that we are focused on, but I think we're undoubtedly committed to a very strong and a vibrant and well-resourced education sector, and Simon Birmingham will have more to say about that this year.
Okay, let's talk about the top end, because that's your responsibility, the north of Australia. There was so much discussed about that in the last election in terms of what was going to be achieved. We've seen a white paper come out, and in the last budget, $5 billion worth of infrastructure spending was allocated to the region. What are we going to see in 2016?
Well, Northern Australia, as we define it for the purpose of our white paper, is above the Tropic of Capricorn. So it takes in those parts of Western Australia and Queensland, and we include all of the Northern Territory. It's 40% of Australia's landmass, but only 5% of Australia's population. What you'll see from us is key economic infrastructure being built up in the north, whether it's water infrastructure, whether it's communications infrastructure, energy infrastructure, or transport infrastructure. Because, Emma, there's huge potential in
all
all
those things in 2016?
Well,
what's the priority?
Well, the priority...
What's the meat on the bone
the priority is this $5 billion Northern Australia infrastructure facility, which is a concessional loan.
But in terms of what you're actually going to be building, what will be the priority?
Well, we've asked for local communities and state governments to put forward their projects. Infrastructure Australia has already put forward a number of projects, and will be introducing legislation this year to implement this concessional loan scheme, which is this $5 billion infrastructure facility. I'll give you one good example. 60% of Australia's rainfall falls above the Tropic of Capricorn, but we only save 2% of it. Imagine if we were able to capture more of that water in dams, and there's a whole lot of different proposals for more dams at the top end. We could irrigate the north and become that food bowl for Asia that we so often talk about. Because the proximity of Northern Australia to Asia means that it can really benefit from the growing urbanisation, the growing middle classes, the growing populations in Asia, and Australia is very well placed to provide those services and that food that is needed.
It's a long-term proposition, though.
It's a medium-term and a long-term proposition, but we've never said any of these things could be done overnight. But the payoff for the whole of Australia is huge.
When are we going to have an election?
Look, that's above my pay grade. I would have thought, Malcolm Turnbull will be looking very closely at all these options. But whenever we bring it on, we're determined to win, because Australia needs a coalition government to remain in power to implement many of the good policies that we have.
But you'd be very happy for a double dissolution based on the workplace reforms?
No, look, there are questions for Malcolm Turnbull and his leadership team to consider, but I'm absolutely certain that we are ready for an election whenever it is called.
Would you welcome an early election?
Look, this is a question for Malcolm Turnbull. I'm not going to give you an answer this morning
us the scoop, Josh.
When no one's watching. Let's hope they are actually going home. But I think, Emma, that there will be an election obviously this year. But I think.
But you're not afraid of a double dissolution election?
I don't think we're afraid of having an election whenever it's brought on. But let's just see what Malcolm Turnbull decides.